Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the May edition of Aviation Historical Society Queensland. Just a reminder for people who are here, if your microphone's turned off, your telephone's sound turned off, be good. We're pleased to be again having the meeting at Archerfield Airport here, home to aviators since the 1930s. And we thank Archerfield Airport Corporation for allowing us to use this departures room on this historic building built about 1940. And welcome to our country and interstate visitors of AHSA Queensland and members of interstate ASHA branches and those joining us by Zoom. We have some visitors tonight, including visitors Queensland Air Museum have been invited to join us, and it'll be interesting to see how many are out there on Zoom. Bill Trail is here, and I'll be introducing him shortly. Just going to give a bit of background about AHSA. In the mid-1960s, I attended AHSA meetings in Sydney at the then Qantas House in Hunter Street, Sydney. AHSA members had held the first meetings in Brisbane from the early 1970s in the then Qantas House, Queen Street building. In May 1973, the idea of starting an aviation museum somewhere came up within AHSA Queensland, and an Air Museum committee was formed. In June of 73, members tendered for a small sum for a Canberra bomber, which was up for disposal. They tendered $1 to start with. That got knocked back, but later they bought it, I think it was $125. And next month, I'll give a short talk on the gestation of Queensland Air Museum. So I won't take up any more time about that on that subject tonight. Just briefly about our speakers for the next several months. 24th of June, Darryl Purdom will be giving a talk on Jindalee OTH, that's Over the Horizon Radar. I beg your pardon, OHT. And July, Ian Campbell thinks he's a bird, will be the topic. And in August 26th, Mark Pilkington, we're talking about CAC Wackett and the Yeoman Cropmaster. And then the 30th of September, Ray Villeman, flying DC-3s in Papua New Guinea. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Will be good, very good. Now, Bill Trail, Queensland Air Museum's president since their last AGM, will give us a rundown on how Queensland Air Museum is these days. Over to you, Bill.
Well, thanks very, very much, Warwick, for actually inviting me, to be perfectly honest. I've done a fair bit of research on the AHSA, and gee, you guys have been around a while and you've done some great stuff. And again, thanks for inviting me. Just to give you a quick rundown on the QAM, we've had a bit of a bad hit with, COVID, like everyone else, especially with volunteers and, of course, income and whatever. The income's picking up quite well, actually, better than actually expected. Our volunteers, we did lose a significant amount of volunteers through the COVID, simply because when it all came back, at the end of the day, they'd moved on, basically. So we're really focusing on increasing our volunteers. We've got 19 tour guides now, and they are very, very experienced people. So we have a tour guides, at least 2 or 3 tour guides there 7 days a week now, which is really good. We're getting some good feedback. We've also just initiated what's called the F111 experience, and we have a couple of RAAF, well, ex-RAAF, one's an Air Commodore and one's an Air Vice Marshal, and they were both on F111. So this experience, the F111 experience, has actually taken off really well, excuse the pun. We are starting to get quite a list of people on hold waiting to go through that experience. We have at the moment about 40 volunteers in the restoration area. Now, that doesn't mean 40 volunteers are there every day. Usually Tuesdays and Wednesdays, it averages around 30, 32, 35. We've got another 6 volunteers in restoration coming through the system. They will be, their names will be read out at the general meeting tomorrow afternoon, actually, and approved. And we've got some really interesting people coming into the organisation as far as volunteers, especially in the restoration area. We'd like to get some more historians. So if any of you guys know of historians out there that are really keen to come and spend time with us, we have some great historians already, but we just don't have enough because there's a lot of things happening, and I'll talk about those now. Just before we go into that, just to let you know that we do have a new team, I guess you could say, but they were already there. It's just that with the change and direction and whatever, there's a lot more volunteers with a lot more skills and experience that we even realised. And we're talking about historians, we're talking about marketing, we're talking about strategic planning people, we're talking about science and technology, engineering, legal, media, all those sorts of experiences. And as I talk about where we're going with the QAM, you'll see why those people are so important to us. It's really the planets have lined up for us. These people were already there. It's just that with the new direction we're going and whatever, they just seem to have found their mojo, and they've just come out and just let their balloons fly, I guess. So we are still working through our restoration program. We do have people working on aircraft. It's a really big deal because we do have a lot of aeroplanes and we're really struggling to keep up, to be quite frank. We have a dedicated teams now that are actually allocated to particular aeroplanes. Now, that's not unusual. That's always been the case. But the main aeroplanes that we're working on at the moment, or aircraft, is the DC-3. It's going through a pretty big restoration program. It's looking really good. It's about to be painted, actually, or actually repainted. So it's almost at the end of its restoration program. It's been a few years. It was started before COVID. It normally would be finished by now, but unfortunately, it's the COVID that's slowed it down. We do have volunteers that are actually in caretaker mode. They're actually continually maintaining aircraft simply because they're out in the weather. We have a caretaker crew working on the Neptune, and that's pretty well a full-time job. It's in really good shape, but we just need to keep it that way. We've found in the past that when we completely restore something, put it back out in the paddock and then walk away and leave it within 12 months, well, we're back to where we started virtually. That's the same with the P3 Orion. It's in really good condition, but again, it's out in the weather. We've got a crew working on the restoration, and it's complete restoration of a tiger moth. It's actually an agricultural tiger moth, which has a fair bit of significance. And we have a group that's about to start on the F-27, the Fokker F-27, with the paint and the body work and whatever, to take it back to its original Ansett colours. So, and once we have our open cockpit weekend, which is in July, after we've gone through that, we're going to crane that F-27 over the top of Hangar 2 and swing it around and drop it into a new place. It'll be its final place where it'll be set up properly. So there's a fair bit going on there. Look, I've only got 5 minutes, so we've since about 6 months ago, we started putting in, and this is down to a guy called Gary Hills, who was actually out there somewhere, Gary. And I was talking to you earlier. Gary's put in our QAM podcasts, and there's some really interesting stories of people, past and present, going onto that podcast. It's really great, including me. And Gary's also initiated the Queensland Air Museum's YouTube channel as well. So we started posting on YouTube as well. We are able to, well, we have been given, I think it's about 5,000 words or something like that, for the Wings magazine, which it's in the September edition. So we've been able to get ourselves involved with that magazine, and so we have people like our marketing people Ron Cascali, our historian, has cast his eyes all over it, and he's also contributed, as he always does. So it's going to be a big thing for us as well. Just to finish off, the Queensland Air Museum is actually just in a 1 in 100 year event, time-wise. It's a 1 in 100 year opportunity. And pretty well, a lot of that piggybacks off the 2032 Olympics. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the Caloundra Aerodrome is about 1.5 years into a 3-year redevelopment plan. I have seen the plan. Of course, in 3 years' time, it won't be the same plan because the plan's evolving. It is going to be an aerospace technology park. It's going to be around about $1 billion worth of infrastructure. Boeing Australia have just announced that they're actually part of that. They're looking at their manufacturing facility. Will be there, and the Air Museum is going to be surrounded by that technology park. So it's a great opportunity for us to get more involved, I guess, not just with the public out there, but also with aerospace industry, because we'll be surrounded by it. And I've actually spent a lot of time talking with those organisations in relation to what we can do as a museum to help them, and what they can do for us as well. So it's really starting to come together. I've also been out and done a survey with 6 of our schools, our secondary, state and private colleges, talking to a lot of the students through their teachers. The teachers have actually driven it, and we've done a survey on what would a young person say, from right from young age all the way through, what would they like to see if they were to come to a air museum? And it's really, really remarkable, some of the feedback we've got, and I'm just in the process now of putting that into a format so it could be published. It is remarkable. Like, I have to be honest, some of the things that came out of even caught me off guard. So there is a tremendous interest and a tremendous future out there for us. The last thing I'll just talk about, because I've got just about a minute to go, we have done a infrastructure site master plan as to what the museum is going to look like in 2028. And that master plan's over 5 stages. We're looking at infrastructure, and that is actually our biggest focus. Not just infrastructure with displays, but infrastructure for our volunteers for restoration and maintenance, because really these guys, like all of us, we're over 65, we're out in the sun all day, and we have just gone through the most horrendous summer ever for volunteers out in the paddock, and it has really, really taken its toll. So our biggest focus is infrastructure. And we do have a couple of grants playing out at the moment that are going to assist us quite well with that. So, and that's why we've had to get the site master plan approved by council, which it has. So we do have a lot of grants out there pending. We've been very successful in a couple of small grants, but we're just waiting on one quite significant grant, which will, if acceptable, and it looks like it's, well, our feedback so far is we're doing really great. And that's for what we call Restoration Hangar 1. It's where we will have a hangar specifically designated for restoration of aeroplanes. So that's pretty well where we're at, without boring you with all the infinite detail. Look, we're working with council, we're working with state and federal government, politicians, we're working with industry, and we're working with education, and we're also working with community as well. We do have a person out there working in the community with other organisations. So, we hope that we have our finger on the pulse. It seems to be working very well. The information we're getting, the feedback we're getting, the response we're getting. is really good. So look, I'll just hold it up at that. I don't know if you guys want to ask any questions or whatever, but I won't take up too much time. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. So again, thanks for letting me have a 5-minute spiel. As I said, I've done a lot of research on you guys, and you know, look, there are synergies there. You know, I don't see why we couldn't work closer together. You know, when I found out about you guys, I was quite amazed. You know, so thanks for your time and thanks for asking me.
Yes, next month, as I commented, I'll make about a 5-minute talk on the history of how QAM started, how it evolved from AHSA.
That'd be fantastic.
And I think there's too many people who aren't aware of the connection, and it's become loose over the last couple of decades. We might change that. Anyway, I'm now going to hand over to our guest speaker, Denis, and he's going to go and tell us his story about the saving of the records.
Right, thank you, and good evening, everybody, and hello to all our Zoom members. My name is Denis Baker. I spent a very long time in Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation and was heavily involved in saving a lot of the historical records of Commonwealth Aircraft and Hawker Havilland Victoria, which we eventually merged into. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about what took place, how that all happened, and share some of the information with you. So I've tried to build a bit of a content table here, and so that I've got books and drawings and things like that that will hopefully show during the presentation. So let's go to the first slide. So a little bit about my background. I started working at CAC in May 1972 at the age of 19 years and 10 months. After a flying instructor friend, who's still alive now, asked his then student pilot, Mr. Charles Reid, who was the senior structures engineer at CAC, if he could help with my employment. At the time, I was a second-year mechanical engineering degree student at the Gordon Institute in the regional town of Geelong. And I'm giving this sort of background for our interstate and overseas Zoom members. And Geelong is approximately 100 k's southwest of Melbourne and therefore Fisherman's Bend, where CAC was located, near the mouth of the Yarra River. Fortunately, Mr. Charles Reid employed me as a junior cadet engineer in the aircraft structures department, and my life was transformed into this wonderful world of aviation. And to this day, I look back on that and I think I've had a wonderful time. You know, nearly 30 years of working, playing with aircraft people, very smart people. And when I joined CAC, they had a fabulous training system in force at the time. So, and that was basically spending short periods in multiple departments around the aircraft company. And so that might mean a few weeks in process engineering, project engineering, the drawing office, photography and printing, and the test department. They were some sub-departments of engineering at the time. And so I got this broad experience of what went into the manufacture, the upkeep, the maintenance, the flying of aircraft. In 1970, the CAC General Manager was Bill Abbott, and he had just replaced Mr. Herb Knight, who was the former aircraft factory manager and a key person working with Sir Lawrence Wackett. And we're all familiar with Sir Lawrence, who was the guiding light that helped establish CAC. and Herb Knight and Sir Lawrence worked together right from the early years. And I wish to talk about Herb Knight because something unusual happened later on in my time at CAC that is related to Herb. So at that time, some of the key engineering and factory personnel from CAC became my mentors and friends. Some of those were Lou Irving, Ian Ring and John Kentwell. They were all engineering managers at different times within engineering. Walter Wally Watkins, we all know Wally Watkins through AHSA. Wally was an aircraft project support engineer. And Jim Caterson was an aircraft test and development engineer. And later on, I worked directly for Jim. And then the Victorian members will know David Anderson. At that time, he was an employee of CAC. He was a technical writer. And now he's a proud owner of a Douglas C-47 Dakota forward fuselage and cockpit that he drags around the countryside to demonstrate to people with interest in aviation. Other people that I'd like to mention, Ted Cogden was the chief draftsman. John McCluskey was the head photographer, a brilliant photographer. David Rees and Reg Ralph, both marketing people at CAC. Some of these very skilled people are still alive today, and I wish to acknowledge them during this talk. There are some very good breakdowns of company structure, projects and staff, and I wanted to try and point these out. Excuse me. In several books, one of which is Brian Hill's Wirraway to Hornet. And many of the photos used in this book were located and prepared by the Historical Projects Group, which is what I'm leading to talk to. So I've tried to secure some of the very early aircraft black and white photos from the very set of special albums that we had at the company. So let me try and find the pointer. So on the left there, we have the site map of where CAC was going to be placed down at Fisherman's Bend. Over in the background there, we have early photos, early placement of General Motors Holden branch at Fisherman's Bend. So that was February 1937. Then we have on the right, lower, a picture of the layout of CAC in 1945, including the runway and one of the taxiways. And the structure of the company was based here. There was an engineering central there. Administration buildings all ran down the middle of the factory. On the left of screen was Aircraft Factory 1, then Aircraft Factory 2, then Aircraft Factory 3, and a little annex at the back of Aircraft Factory 3. On the right-hand side, we had the engine factory, and eventually this section was filled with engine test houses. Over the right-hand end was the Bellman hangars, which were stores hangars, and then the Butler hangar, which was the flight test hangar. And in the end of my time at CAC, I spent a lot of time in the Butler hangar. In these albums, we have some wonderful photos. Many of you might have seen these before. So here we have the first Wirraway flight test photos with all the visitors and key managers of CAC. out the front of aircraft hangar 1. And I'd like to note that in that window there, I spent many, many months looking after the Bell 206 Kiowa flight testing that took place based on the compass swing area, which was where these people are standing. Also, I want to come back to these towers on the Aircraft Factory 1 and talk about that, because Herb Knight is connected to those towers. The buildings were all based on North American aviation aircraft structure, and it was copied into the assembly here because that was the easiest way to build a modern production facility. Over on these, we have on the right-hand side, we have first flight in 1937, sorry, I've slipped that date. And the aircraft was sitting outside the large hangar doors. And over here we have all the staff out watching the flight. This particular aircraft, which I can't read the tail number, was positioned and photographed in 1939. Then in the same album, we have factory assembly lines and flights of aircraft, particularly Wirraway in that early day, looking out of Aircraft Factory 1 through the hangar doors. Then in-flight service pictures. A lot of you may have seen these. And then up on the top picture here is A20-20 being prepared for delivery in October 39 with additional fuselages around out the back behind the aircraft. Things getting ready. And then down on the lower right-hand photo, fuselage frame assemblies for the Wirraway. What I'd like to note is the tail number there enabled us to identify the aircraft. So the number there is R7581, and the little description after up the top here, it was the 7th aircraft in the R batch, and the eventual tail number was A20581. And so these photos, they've been acknowledged to Hawker de Havilland, Victoria. These photos were photos that we found in the archive, in the photographic archive. Another important shot that many of you may have seen is the Mustang flying over the top of CAC, showing a very good position of the main runway and the taxiway. With some of the engine assembly and test facilities filling that gap from that previous photo. And then we have the assembly line views of the Mustang, the tail section, a propeller being installed, and then into the engine shop in 1946. And then here we have the main plane on the landing gear coming up the line, ready for a fuselage to be fitted to it. So these photographic albums are large format albums, and they're very, very rare. They're now stored in the archive in a in a secret place because their value is just too great. So what led me to forming the Historical Projects Group? So HPG in July 1987. So I'd been there at that stage for quite a long time, 15 years. And so during that time, I connected with many, many people because of the training system that we had at CAC. Moving around those different departments, I got to meet all the key people and talk to them. So in 85, Hawker de Havilland Australia and CAC merged into one entity called Hawker de Havilland Victoria Limited, under the leadership of General Manager Mr. Tony Carolan. At this time, I was well and truly cemented into testing roles, having been on the Barra Sonobuoy mechanical and test and development team down in the Butler hangar or the flight hangar. We also had a very large above ground freshwater test pool that was nearly 30 feet deep and at least 30 feet in diameter, where we tested the Barra Sonobuoy. And that was above ground. I then went on to, from after Barra and the Kiowa flight test team. So I became the junior flight test engineer and spent time flying with the test pilot, accepting tests on the Kiowas. So I have quite a number of aircrew hours on Kiowas. I then transitioned from that to the RAF P3C AQS 901 integration and test team. That was putting a very large Sonix processor into the airframe, modifying the airframe with all the structural applications, adding changes to the air conditioning to improve the internal capacity in the aircraft to cool all the black boxes, because the AQS 901 processor was very, very large and required an upgrade to the air conditioning on the airframe. I then transitioned into project managing an air transportable mobile medical facility for the RAF. And that was the design and manufacture of that system, which was 2 large towable air transportable shelters that could interconnect and be towed up to 100 kilometres an hour and hard-walled, air conditioned, and they could be, 2 of them could be transported in a C-130 and then travel to a site where we wanted to build a mobile medical facility. So I gained all this wonderful experience of developing things and meeting many, many experienced people. Getting back to the Historical Projects Group, I was hoping I would be able to show a picture of a file of one of Sir Lawrence Wackett's historic files. Unfortunately, they're all buried in deep cover in the Moorabbin Aircraft Museum at the moment, or under the ownership of ARG, the Australian Aircraft Restoration Group. And but what happened was these files came from what was called the White House. So I'll just go back a little bit. So out here in front of engineering, there was a big administration building put in place, and I believe it is still there now, in around all the redevelopment that has taken place. And we used to call it the White House. As you understand, the general manager and his management team were there. So going back to this, this file was found by one of the volunteers that worked with me within the company to find files and historical information. And one of the guys was searching the plant for records and called me up and in some dilemma and dragged me to a mezzanine floor in Aircraft Factory 2, which go back. So 1, Aircraft Factory 2, over here. There were little mezzanine floors where there were special spare parts sections in the factory. And what this, I call him young because we're all pretty young there. And he found this dump bin with all these files that looked very special. So we climbed into the dump bin, and sure enough, they were part of Sir Lawrence Wackett's files that had been taken out of the White House as new people moved in, and those that took them out didn't necessarily understand their historic significance. So when we got those, we realised that we needed to do something to make sure we didn't lose any more. Because out of that package, there was only 20 plus files of the original Sir Lawrence Wackett files. And we determined that the remainder had probably already gone. So I immediately approached my line manager at the time, which was Jim Caterson, and the new Hawker de Havilland Victoria General Manager, Tony Carolyn. And from that meeting, we felt that we needed to form a historical projects group to take control of these processes formally within the company. And in doing that, I reported to both of these gentlemen. So it's very important that people understand that Jim Caterson and Tony Carolyn were key people in saving these records. And this all wouldn't have happened if I didn't have that support at that time. So once that was formally established and promulgated across the plant, what we found was many managers and staff started to clean out their office spaces of documents kept from previous projects, and the collection began to grow exponentially. So we had to find storage space within the factory, and unfortunately, very large factory. And we then stored all these records, and we had wonderful support from key people across the factory. And there's several other stories that will highlight that. We also had, go back there. I mentioned David Anderson, long-time AHSA member and former CAC employee. So when I started, David was already at CAC, and David had been ferreting around, and he also pointed me in the direction of the CAC photographic records. And in that area, there was a wonderful collection of large format black and white negatives from the past. And they covered everything from 1936 right through to the time when Sir Lawrence Wackett left the company. So a fantastic record. They were all numbered, and there were lists that filled in many of the places, and in some cases, each of these 4x4 black and white negatives were in packets, pardon me, of 10 or 20 negatives. So a great collection. Also under the photographer, head photographer, John McCluskey, were many other negatives and colour photos covering more recent publications and activities at CAC. So they were identified and they needed to be consolidated into the collection. Fortunately, they were all in multiple slide shelves and very well numbered. And so in all, there's several thousand of these photographic records. And so that collection is very priceless. And over my time, I've used those photos for many of the people surrounding us who are doing CAC aircraft restorations. We've been able to find those photos of the specific part, find the drawing, and then make that available to the owners of the aircraft. And in many cases, that enabled those people to get those aircraft into the air. Realising the significance of all this, in 1988, we had concerns. The company was sort of breaking up into unusual little subsections. And I proposed that we protect all the records under the Australian Bicentennial Records Search legislation, which meant that all the records became one and there was no possibility of siphoning off one item, and therefore they protected. We made that happen, and that has kept the records together. So that has been a very good bit of legislation, and that still applies today. Another interesting find at the company was to do with older CAC aircraft logbooks and maintenance records. So I was up in the flight hangar, working up there as a test engineer, working on Barra and moving in and out of there onto P3 Orion, P3C Orion flight test programs in Edinburgh, RAF Edinburgh. And because we had this established program of historical projects group in the company, the receivables manager contacted me and said, you might be interested in something that's turned up at the hangar, the Bellman hangars, which are down near the flight hangar. And it was a wooden storage box that had been returned from the RAF in 1995. And it had come back from a storage facility, I believe it was Tocumwal, when they were cleaning all that out. So we opened this prize, and inside, what did we find? Logbooks, maintenance records of Wirraway aircraft, and some Winchell and some Sabre aircraft. And from that, we were, wherever possible, we carried out research and found the current owners of the aircraft concerned, and the corresponding records were offered to those owners at a small cost to cover postage. And one of the key ones to remember was A2695, now owned by Ross Parker at Caboolture Airfield, north of Brisbane. The maintenance records for that aircraft went to Ed Field, who was the original syndicate owner of the aircraft. And from that, it enabled them to get 695 into the air. This is my original notes that I wrote to myself at the time, and I've kept all this information. So it was found on the 24th of the 10th, 1995, and the list of logbooks is approximately 60, and wherever there was an aircraft that we found an owner, I wrote a note to myself that I wrote a letter to Ed, which I still keep, and they're all in the archive, to make that logbook and information available to him and his syndicate. And recently I met Ross Parker and we were talking about that, and he hadn't realised that his maintenance records came from this box from this time. So it was very good. We were able to pass Windjill logbooks, and they were compass logbooks, maintenance logbooks, all the repair information that might have happened with these aircraft, the full history. And so we were able to pass the Windjill and Sabre records to RAF Museum at Point Cook, and they subsequently went into maintaining the aircraft that were down there and the aircraft that are now at Temora under 100 Squadron ownership. So very important things to demonstrate what you can do if you have a proper system in place. Over several years in that period, the Historic Project Group volunteers and management became concerned about the safety of the historical records, because there were pushes to break up the company and sell off elements of it. And so I was tasked with trying to find a location where we could move all these collected records for safety. And so some of the organisations I approached was the National Air and Space Museum of Australia, located at that time at RAF Point Cook, Queensland Archives, because I'd relocated by late 97, I'd relocated, or was intending to relocate, and Victoria Museum and archive locations around Melbourne, private collections in Victoria. And we wanted to keep the records in Victoria because they were related to a Victorian enterprise. And after due consideration, we elected to move all the historical records to NASMA at Point Cook. And again, I have all the original letters and annexes listing all the items that were going to that organisation. And in early 97, we employed E.W. Hogan Moving and Storage to pack everything up with the help of our volunteers. And we took several Pantex of records, models, to NASMA, which was in the flight training, the old flight training school at RAF Point Cook, which is RAF Williams now. So these are some of, this is the 3-page letter that was signed by my then systems engineering general manager, Jim Caterson, on behalf of Hawker de Havilland, Victoria. And in that, we outlined the relocation. And then attached to that letter were several annexes listing the archives and the collection, right down to WACAT files, industry files, aircraft project files, photographic negatives, photographic handouts, and so on. So by having that and keeping that, we were able to then, in following years, subsequent years, we were able to identify the complete collection and then arrange with Boeing, who became the owner because Boeing took over Hawker de Havilland, Victoria, and therefore became the owner of the records. And from that, we were able to then move them on. So the records languished at RAF Point Cook for many years, especially after the demise of NASMA. And that's a story in itself. Very, very keen people who were working together to try and make a big museum, but didn't happen. Then we had the wonderful RAF museum staff. They were given access to a lot of the drawings and aperture cards. So hard to describe it because I don't have a photo of it now, but there was an aperture card storage box that was made up of multiple shelves that stood about this high, which is probably about 4 feet. And it was just as wide and just as deep. And it had multiple drawers in it with thousands of aperture cards of every aircraft project that CAC worked on. So CA1, so if you wanted a part, you could look in to the CA1 aperture cards, pull out, say, the centre section, and then you could pull out the assembly drawing on an aperture card and all the subsequent parts. So that file was very, very important to protect. Included in that, down in the bottom drawers of this wonderful collection, were aperture cards of CA15, Wacket, early Wacket aircraft, and those sort of things. So quite a wonderful collection. And Dave Jones and Dave Gardner at the RAF Museum at the time then looked at those and where they needed them, printed their drawings on their own aperture reader and printer and used those for aircraft restoration within the RAF fleet. Fortunately, around this same time, another dear friend, Mark Pilkington, also a member of AHSA and at that time, Secretary of ARG, Australian Aircraft Restoration Group at Moorabbin, had a meeting with Dave Gardner and John White from the Australian War Memorial at the 50th anniversary dinner in May 2012. The CAC historical records subject was mentioned by Mark, and these people helped approach Boeing Australia, the then legal owner of the records. And in 2014, a transfer of the records to ARG and the Moorabbin Aircraft Museum took place. In that intervening period, ARG have committed substantial resources to have the records digitised and entered into the Victorian collections database for all the world to access in the future. So I'd like to acknowledge Mark Pilkington and the ARG board at the time, along with the current archivist, David Collier, also the current ARG secretary. They should be commended for this outcome, and they're working through that very diligently. So far, 3,253 individual records have been uploaded to the Victoria Collections database that you can look at online. This one is an example of some of the collection that I wanted to show to everybody. CAC had fantastic capability during its time. It designed, manufactured a complete ICARA missile and handling system for the Royal Australian Navy. It went into the River and Perth class of ships. And this demonstration model of the system was made in the CAC woodworking shop, where all the wind tunnel models were made as well. So what we have is the storage system for individual ICARA missiles, each one holding a torpedo. And these were all hydraulically manipulated. They would come from these storage bins here and here. They would move to the centre rail, and then the launcher would move around and line itself up with an arm that folded out from the major magazine here through a set of doors, blast doors, and then the missile was loaded into the launcher. So the launcher and all this assembly for all of those ships was designed and manufactured at CAC. The missile and the torpedo side of it was carried out by Government Aircraft Factory, which was next door to CAC. And we then, so when I say we, I mean the company, then worked to sell that system to other companies around the world. And so they went to the Brazilian Navy, the Chilean Navy, the Royal New Zealand naval vessels. So Brazilian was called Brannick. Chilean used Brannick because they were in the same hemisphere. And Royal Australian New Zealand naval vessels used the ICARA, the same as the Australian Royal Navy. And in some of the things that I started looking about, Australian submariners used to refer to ICARA as insufficient knowledge and random action, because it enabled the ship to locate a submarine, fire a missile carrying a homing torpedo out to a range of 19 kilometres, then drop the torpedo, and which hopefully would home in onto the submarine. So quite a fantastic system. And then I was fortunate enough at the time to be working in the flight hangar, and we had a full-sized handling system in part of the flight hangar where naval officers and staff were brought to train on using that system and maintaining it. That full system eventually moved, I believe, to HMAS Cerberus, and I've asked a couple of people to find out what then happened to it. But fantastic capability. And records, you know, ARG and Moorabbin Aircraft Museum have all this. Those photos were only taken in the last few days. Some additional stories that I'd just like to mention. Herb Knight was the aircraft factory manager and general manager before Bill Abbott joined in early 1970, before I started at CAC. In my moving around the factory, particularly through the drawing office, there are many people that were former World War II employees, and they all had a story. So one story was, are there records hidden in one of those towers on the front of Aircraft Factory 1? And it always stuck in my mind. So towards the early to mid 90s, we had a very successful team of volunteers. So one night we actually went up into that mezzanine floor leading up into the tower, popped the intervening roof panels in that office, put a big ladder up into the tower and climbed up into the tower. And when we got up there, we found dozens and dozens of drawings for the CA23, the CA21, and wonderful schematic drawings that in some cases were 20 feet long, showing the construction of the Mustang fuselage and particularly the air intake underneath the fuselage. And at that time, some members may remember that the Mustang bellied in at Point Cook and was severely damaged. We were able to use that drawing to help them rebuild that part of the aircraft. And several other Mustang people were looking for similar sort of things, and those drawings went there and helped them. So we reprinted. So that was amazing. The story was real. Herb Knight didn't want to give back certain drawings to the RAF. We were instructed to give drawings back on CA23 and CA21. But here's this stack of these drawings up in the very top of one of those towers. So these towers had an open top inside them, and you can see the that was the ceiling above the offices. So over on the left side of aircraft factory, this side here, aircraft factory 1, the next tower over, which was the last tower or corner tower, was where we confirmed that story that Herb Knight had told a draftsman in the drawing office, and sure enough, it was real. So we had to believe what we were told, and that all gave a great heritage to the records. The other one was employee history cards. So during World War II, approximately 3,000 people worked at CAC. And what did I find? A history card with my father's name on it. And my father, Sydney Henry Baker, also from Geelong, worked at CAC. But unfortunately, after finding that card and copying the details into a piece of paper that I still have in my wallet to this day, an employee who was tasked to clean out the area where the history cards were kept destroyed them all while I was away on a flight test program in RAF Edinburgh, and came back, and I was terribly upset by that. But what it said about my father is he worked at CAC from the 8th of the 4th, 1940 to the 5th of the 8th, 1940 as a junior machinist. He lived care of the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, at Princess Bridge, Melbourne, and was a member of the Coachmakers Union. I'm yet to approach the union to see if they have any record. That's one of my next programs to move on. And that he'd moved to the Department of Aircraft Production next door to CAC. So quite a remarkable find. And to think that we nearly had all the original records of every employee before digitisation and computer, and they were lost, unfortunately. Yeah. The message hadn't got through to those people who were tasked with cleaning places out. Anyway, my father then went on to become a civilian technical liaison officer between the RAF and the 5th US Air Force based in Brisbane during World War II. And Peter's aware of this. I have photos of the Qantas hangar here on Archerfield with aircraft in it being serviced, and they were in my father's records. And my father then went on to working at Hangar 7, and not a lot of people may know about Hangar 7 at Eagle Farm, which was where all the Japanese captured aircraft and componentry were assessed by the Allied Air Technical Intelligence Unit. So these connections that you find from records are very, very important. So some of the reference documents, if you're researching CAC, I wanted to bring these to people's attention. First one is the autobiography, Lawrence James Wackett, aircraft pioneer. Sir Lawrence produced this by himself, and it's a marvellous read. So if you're doing any research, please keep that in mind. The next one was We're Away to Hornet by Brian Hill, and Hawker de Havilland, Victoria, sponsored Brian to do this work. And I spent many, many months with Brian securing technical information and photographs that he could use to produce that book. The other one that I think is a good reference guide is a series of books of CAC aircraft in service with the RAAF by Stuart Wilson around the period of 1991. I supplied a lot of technical information to Stuart, and Stuart put these things together. Wonderful books about history of CAC aircraft. The other interesting one that I found just the other day was CAC in the Future. It was an internal seminar by and for CAC, and it was held at the Australian Institute of Management in Melbourne in August 1976. And I can actually remember attending that with all the engineering staff. But that's another great book with photographs and technical information about projects. Next one that I'm hoping many people might be happy to see is this original drawing, well, blueprint. And so upside down, F01, F stands for foreign drawings within the CAC drawing office system. So this was produced by the RAF Area Technical Office on the 4th of the 10th, 1941. So people were really concerned about the Japanese, and this is one of the outcomes. A RAF developed version of the Wirraway called WA1 up there, and its title was Wirraway Aircraft Twin Float Conversion. And that's all up in that area there in the title block. So one of the training processes at CAC was spending months in the drawing office and understanding title blocks on drawings. And if you're going to research aircraft and repair aircraft, you need to understand all that, because it gives you all the guides of the parts that go into the aircraft or that particular drawing. And that's the original blueprint. That was good. Then we go on to another thing that the company, Sir Lawrence Wackett, instigated with Herb Knight and all the other senior managers across the company were plant superintendent reports. And I've actually brought these along with me. So these are my copies of the originals that are in the archive. And they started at number 1 here in November 26, 1937. And then they cover all the range of items that the factory was manufacturing. Delivery times, problems, all those sort of things. And then the middle one is plant report. It then became called plant report number 95 in 1941. And these are notes that one of the managers wrote on the set to make a note for himself. And I think it's 19 total. No, total 41. Not sure. And then the last one, plant progress report. So they went from plant reports to plant progress report 228. And that was in December 1948. And that's when that system of record keeping and reporting to the management team stopped. I'm just about finished, Pete. So if anybody has any questions, I'll try and do my best to answer them, particularly the Zoom members. And Warwick, I'll leave you to coordinate that, please.
Yes, Dennis. This is not a question, but about 25 years ago, when I was a volunteer at Nowra at the Naval Museum, and they were bringing in the new helicopters, they needed a lot more room, and they were going through the same process that you discussed. And I saw a tip truck full of a couple of, I suppose, sheds full of all of the information that applied to all of the previous aircraft that the Navy had flown with logbooks, the whole works, an entire tip truck, and away it went.
Yes.
All lost.
Yeah. Well, this is why we ensured that they had to be protected, because their heritage, they're our national heritage, and it was very important to make sure they were saved and then digitised to be made available to people. So it was a very long-term look at the world. And I'd been brought up in a family who'd been involved in manufacture, production and history. So I had a really good grounding from a young guy, and I needed to do something. And I wanted to make sure. And fortunately, we now have them at Moorabbin Aircraft Museum, and going in to a very safe, secure location where people eventually will be able to look at them. So
does that mean it's a guarantee that you'll stay in Australia?
yes.
Good.
Well, the bicentennial record search legislation says they can't leave the country, they can't be broken up, they can't be separated. So that's why I employed that system, to make sure it was that wouldn't happen.
There'll always be restoration, won't there?
Yes, yeah.
Congratulations on what you've done.
Thank you.
Hello, Dennis.
Are
It's
there any
David,
questions from the Zoom audience out there?
David Fredericks here, Air Force History and Heritage.
Go ahead.
Hello. Dennis, congratulations on doing what you've done. Amazing project. So we in the Air Force are trying to do similar, and we're trying to digitise them and digitising our records. So it's good to see yours being done the same way and protected. Is there a vision to make these publicly accessible online so researchers can actually get to them rather than being at Moorabbin? Is that a vision you have?
Yes, that's the idea of putting them into the Victorian collections database, because then you should be able to open that record, make a request to the museum and organise a print or whatever it may be required. Yes, so they will become accessible.
Okay, all right, that's great. Because obviously Joe Vella's online as well, and I've been doing research into Hubert Boss Walker, who would appear around the time of having the history from the Wirraway, the Wacket train, the Wacket, etc. So
He's a Wacket bomber.
bomber, yeah. So yeah, very interesting to see, to actually be able to access some of those and be able to search some of those. So thank you very much for the presentation.
It's still some time away, but the first step is to digitise the complete record, put them on the database, and then drill down into them to see what is internally in there. So it's a mammoth task.
Denis, Joe Vella.
G'day, Joe.
Yes, we go back a long way.
Yes, we
and
do.
you remember me fossicking around in 1983 under the assistance of David Rees and Tony Carolyn. I did it for 3 years.
Yes.
However, so all that material now is in a book which was released 3 weeks ago. It's called The Aircraft Projects of CAC. $65, print on demand. 407 pages. 407 pages.
Yes.
It's really, it weighs 1.4 kilos. So it's a lot of brain matter.
I brought a few other things along with me. So 50th anniversary CAC decals that we produced for the 50th anniversary. We had a big party at the factory where we lined up examples of every aircraft that CAC had manufactured. And there's wonderful photos of that aircraft layout across the compass swing area at CAC. And we also produced a 50th anniversary booklet covering aircraft and engines that the company produced.
If I may, Denis, David Fredericks here again. The story I have from CAC was visiting the Res Engines office back in back in 1988 when CAC was, and well, there was CAC and there was Dirty Harry's. And I can remember going in there, and CAC had the job of maintaining the Mirage radomes. And on this particular day, when the foreman had walked away to go and get his morning tea, he left his apprentice and said, cut the radome in half and then we'll take the honeycomb out and we'll do the replacement. And as he actually meant was to remove it from the inside, from the outside. When he came back, the foreman found that the radome had been cut perfectly in half down the middle, and here was the techo with the screwdriver trying to flick it out. That radome was then left hanging at the top of the doorway going into the Res Eng office. So whenever a CAC person came in to have a complaint about something about Air Force, they would set that first up and it would destabilise them from that point on.
Yes, I vaguely remember that because I spent a fair time in the Res Eng office because of the flight testing work that we did and finding parts and things like that. So I'm familiar. It was right down the front of the admin building.
Yeah, upstairs. Yep. If anyone's looking for other reference material on Lawrence Wacket, the National Library of Australia has his collection in a trunk that's kept upstairs. It's very much worthwhile going in there and getting a chance to go through it. There's some amazing diagrams and his handwritten notes, etc. So it really adds to the story. And I think it actually puts a bit more meat on the bones to what he talks about in his book. There is a degree of embellishment in his book, and this puts a bit of the reality to some of those things when you read what was being written to and from between him and the Air Force.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And some of the other things that viewers might not also know is CAC built houses, complete houses, for many years after the war. And some of those houses are still standing now down in South Melbourne, Port Melbourne, because they became part of the village for the games. Yeah.
Are they aluminium framed houses?
No, they were generally wood. They may have had some aluminium, but there's wonderful photos in the records of all the housing. A deliverette, we made, or the company made, a little aluminium skin deliverette van, and that original prototype is in the museum in Victoria, and it was used as like a prototype delivery van for bread and milk, and it had a little BMW motorbike engine in it, and so that was another one that they try and worked on, because after the war, the projects all finished, they had to find employment for people, or otherwise they all would have been let go, and it was too important to hang on to these people. So these records that we have cover all those sort of amazing things. There's a beautiful album, like those key photos that at the start, there's one on housing, there's one on buses. CAC made thousands of buses. And I was there during that period where aircraft manufacture was converted into bus manufacture. They were great buses.
I see some hands up from the people out there in Zoom land.
Yeah.
Do you have a question, Mark?
Yes, I do.
Your question, comment, Mark.
I have been waiting quietly, but I was grabbing some items. If I could screen share some items that might jog Denis's memory, and telling a story out of school, I guess. Firstly, thanks to Denis, when I was building a Wirraway project kit set, I was one of the beneficiaries of his program to pass down those logbooks to people who had the mortal remains. So I actually have still today the logbooks for A20 601 and 605, and I was surprised to see Denis's meticulous record of those being issued to me in 1896. The other thing, Denis and I have collaborated heavily on the preservation and protection of the CAC collection, and that started with his own efforts that he's done a wonderful job of outlining to us today. He gave me an SMS late in the evening, just earlier this week, asking to clarify some records for this presentation. What he didn't tell me was he wanted photographs of things, and if I could screen share for a second. Unfortunately, I've been playing around with a number of different screens, and I don't think I've got access to the screen share. Let me go to full screen. Yeah, I'm not sure.
You have now.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So I guess firstly, if I can show that, that's A2601's logbook, still preserved through really Denis's efforts, and that will end up in the CAC collection at Moorabbin. Again, a legacy of his great work. The other one, which probably was really what you should have asked me for the other night, Denis, if I'd known you were looking for it, is that photo.
That's the one. So, yes, Mark.
Yes.
That is the aperture card storage box with all the aperture card drawings of every aircraft CAC manufactured, every part. And that is an amazing collection. You can find
in fact,
anything.
That's only half of it, because that's one of two twin cabinets that I've only got a photo taken at Moorabbin of one side of the bank of two. And the estimate is there's about 200,000 aperture cards, 35mm microfilm aperture cards sitting in those two cabinets.
Okay.
I collect my own CAC items, and two things that I guess will eventually end up in the CAC collection is Sir Lawrence Wackett didn't just write his biography, he wrote two fishing books, we'd call them, because we're aircraft nuts, but his fishing books are well sought after. This is one I purchased recently, signed by him and acknowledged as a gift to Reg Ansett in May 1952. I can't afford his other one. His first one today exchanges for about $900 because of its value as a fly fishing guide. You know, that's another aspect to Sir Lawrence Wackett. And then finally, Norm Clifford had a lot to do with Sir Lawrence towards the end of Sir Lawrence's life. And I purchased this from Norm Clifford, who's still alive today, via his daughter. And this is a hand-drawn sketch of the installation of a machine gun on the top of an AFC, and I can't tell you the aircraft off the top of my head, I haven't researched for this, but this is his hand-drawn sketch in explaining to Norm Clifford, you know, how this was developed. And there's an adjoining handwritten letter from Sir Lawrence describing this. So just some of the items that are out there, and this too I would expect and hope ends up in the CAC collection at Moorabbin in the final outcome. So yes, again, congratulations to Denis. The collection is a wonderful resource. Unfortunately, as Denis explained, it was grabbed, you know, at the last minute before it went into dump masters mainly. So it wasn't a corporate archive catalogued over the 50 odd years of the business. And today it's still not fully catalogued and indexed to know exactly what jewels are held within it, but it's a wonderful collection. Thank you. And again, well done, Denis.
Warwick, again, asking a question. You're talking about all the work's got to be done with digitising all this. Is somebody being employed to do that, or is some volunteer doing it?
They have employed Corrections Victoria to do copying. So they were sending batches of photographs or negatives and documents to jails or correction centres that have the capability, but I'm not up to speed with that. Mark might be able to update that one.
And by the way, Mark, what's for the people who don't know who Mark is and there's no photograph of you, what's your surname? Where are you from?
Well, I'm Mark Bilkington. I'm a former secretary of the Australian Aircraft Restoration Group at Moorabbin. I'm no longer on the board there, so I'm not speaking on their behalf tonight. I am an ongoing financial member and strong supporter of that collection, but I'm just a member, like anyone else can be. I'm the current secretary of AHSA Inc. Down here in Victoria, and I'm also the president of the Friends of the RAF Museum. And I haven't shared my photo because you don't really need to see my ugly mug. So getting back to the question, a very innovative strategy was developed by Ed, and I'm not going to get his surname correct, so I'm going to call him Ed Mastowich, and just forget that I didn't pronounce it correctly because I haven't got it on screen in front of me to pronounce. But Ed is a member of Moorabbin as well. He funded scanning technology. He negotiated a deal with the Victorian Justice Department's prison system to position this equipment at the HMS, or whatever it is, Her Majesty's Prison at Ararat, and selected prisoners who were, you know, convinced to be known to be reliable, were then employed not by the museum, but by the Justice Department process to scan these documents. And when I say documents, they're more scanning negative items through a digital scanner.
Thank you. Next question on these.
Yeah, can I, up here in Sydney, we used to have a Hawker de Havilland Boeing factory at Bankstown Airport. When they closed, the records were transferred to a museum down the road and never been seen again. Does anyone know what's happened there? I know you're Victoria and Queensland, but it'd be a terrible shame if the records were lost like the Victorian ones were originally. There were pallet loads of stuff, I gather, that were packed
Yes,
at
there
Boeing
were.
in Sydney.
Yes, that's correct. There were a large number. There was an active historical projects group within Hawker de Havilland Bankstown, and they worked diligently to keep the files together. And I believe it went to Haas, wasn't it? Is that the story you've heard?
I don't know. I have contact with Haas, but I'd have to talk to, do you know Maureen Massey down there?
I know of Maureen, but
Yeah, I'll have to ask her. It's just from the AHSA New South Wales point of view, we just want to make sure it's safely stored or going to be displayed.
Around the time of the merger, we had many discussions across the two sites to set up similar things. So there was an active group in Bankstown. Yeah, so I understood all those records were then consolidated and moved to Haas, and there was a similar sort of system within Haas to protect them. So, yeah, certainly make contact with Haas to find out what took place.
Thank
because
you.
the records there were marvellous records.
They were.
Yeah.
Because obviously we had the vampire built there and the mosquito, and those are very important. Thank you very much.
Well, just on that, I am aware Haas have mosquito drawings, so I believe it is probably at Haas.
Okay, I'm going there next month, so I'll follow up.
Yeah, there is a significant digitising archive team at Albion Park, so my understanding is they have digitised mosquito drawings.
Thank you.
Well, we might wind it up there. So very good. Thank you very much, Denis.
Thank you.
for your lovely talk.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Thank you.
Good night. Well done, Denis, and keep safe, everybody.